One of the things that maybe it's important to just give a bit of a background on the project. My research, I'm an anthropologist, and my research is basically an in-depth study of Black Muslim activism within the context of a Black Lives Matter movement in the northeastern United States. And so I wanted to kind of think about the ways that that my research participants are or were during the time that I was doing field work, engaging in activism around issues of racial justice, but also how they were connecting that to their identity, both as Black people, but also as Muslims, and what legacy that they were drawing on in order to do that. And one of the things that I found was that the Muslims in my research study, by and large, had a very strong sense of the reasons behind the reasons why they were motivated, in part because these issues, of course, affected their own lives, but also because they felt that their identity as Muslims gave them a moral, presented them with a moral obligation to fight injustice, right? And so, so to do that, of course, they were drawing upon not only the Quranic dictates to making sure that we are fighting oppression, right, wherever we find it and that sort of thing, but also they were drawing upon the legacies of Muslims, earlier Black Muslims in this part of the world, who, in many cases, really came and turned to Islam and converted to Islam in large numbers, in part as a way of engaging with racism and white supremacy. So they're drawing on these two legacies in order to make an intervention in the present in issues of continuing racial injustice. And you know, maybe a second interesting point with regard to that. It's not only engaging in acts of what we would traditionally label protests, right? Like, you know, participating in rallies or organizing marches and fundraising and advocacy. Those things were all present, but in many ways also given the fact that they exist as racial and religious minorities in this part of the world, and everything that kind of goes with that. Being Muslim, right? Being and actually practicing Islam in some ways also is an act of protest within this context. Race is absolutely at the center of everything that happened in New Zealand, it's probably useful to recall that the shooter articulated a very deep philosophical entanglement with white supremacist ideas. And this was the motivation for the shooting. You know, he felt very much that his country, right, was being invaded by foreigners, by others, right? So race and xenophobia are at the very heart of the incident itself, right? So it has to come into question when we're talking about how we talk about it afterwards, right? Race is absolutely, like there's no divorcing race and racism and xenophobia from what happened there and how we're talking about it. Some of the ways that this plays out in the American and the U.S. media in particular, of course, a lot of what we see is this difficulty with understanding and talking about Muslims as victims of violence, right? In many of the common U.S. narratives in terms of how Muslims are portrayed publicly, it's very easy to think about Muslims as perpetrators of violence because this is the common narrative. But as victims of terrorism, I think the U.S. media has been struggling in order to do that, and that's absolutely shaped by the logics of race and Islamophobia, because Islamophobia is racism, right? It is, and Muslims in the U.S. and in many parts of the Western world are racialized, right, and understood in the Western imaginary as a darker other, and that's in spite of the fact that we have Muslims in all shades, but Muslims are in fact racialized as other, right? And within the context of U.S. history, of course, given that the history of the development of Islam in the U.S. Starts with enslaved African Muslims, right? And for most of the 20th century is most heavily associated with African American Muslims, with Black Muslims, right? There's like Islam and Muslims in public discourse is always about race, sure, right? And so that's one way that it shows up. Interestingly, one of the other ways that it's shown up, I've seen a lot of stories that have tended to place the victims, the actual victims of the shooting, in the margins of the story, which, and at the forefront of what we've been talking about in many cases in the U.S. media around the New Zealand tragedy is the acts of solidarity by primarily white New Zealanders, which is on one level, it's good to see that, right? I mean, obviously you want to see people kind of standing in solidarity with people who have been traumatized in this way. But that's not the center of the story. And so I think there's this irresistible urge to place whiteness at the center, right? That we many times almost can't help. And so that has become the primary story. So whether it's the New Zealand Prime Minister, whether it's New Zealand white New Zealand anchor women wearing hijab on camera, like it's about. I mean, and again, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't do this or that but it's also like the people who were killed, who were from a variety of racial backgrounds, but many of them were black and brown Muslims, for them to not be the faces that we see, the names that we remember, and at the very forefront of what we're talking about and what's at stake here, is to me an example of how race in a more subtle way, right, tends to play a role in how we've been understanding and processing this tragedy.